lecture that was given by Hatem Bazian. Do you know him? At the University of California, Berkeley. Yeah, and this is a segue into the next issue here, because he established the Islamophobia studies and the journal in Berkeley. Now, I remember he said this. He said, you know, in business, a businessman, you know, Islamic Muslims, they start off a transaction with Bismillah, and they end up with Alhamdulillah, and in between it's all Adam Smith, which I loved. I said to him, well, not Adam Smith, maybe Milton Friedman would be a better example. Adam Smith actually had ethics. He wrote a book on morals, right, on morality. But that's a nice introduction to this next topic on Islamophobia, which Hatem Bazian really has developed more than anybody else. And in fact, I was just looking here, there is an app, an Islamophobia app for mobile phones, so that you can report an incident of an Islamophobic incident and report it that goes to his organisation, and then so that they can monitor and provide evidence and statistics on Islamophobic activities.
Care also collects some of these complaints.
Oh, right. Yeah.
They report.
Yeah. But that's an interesting development, it seems to me, and that's empowering people at the local level to actually document what's going on, because most stuff just goes. So, Islamia, this is, I thought, quite a nice definition, based on a unidimensional conception of an essentialized Islam and racialized Muslim. Fueled by negative prejudices and stereotypes, it results in attitudes asserting undesirability, distrust, and hostility.
So where's the app from?
The app? Look, I'm sorry, I should have put it on an overhead. I subscribe to this, so I get this the Islamophobia studies. You can go to, if you just go to Islamophobia studies on the website, I'm sure you'll find it. And it's always, this is Islamophobia Studies Center, Berkeley, California. Islamophobia is the new status quo. So, yeah, you'll find it if you just Google. I think if you Google that. If you don't find it, let me know, and I can just give you this. I've got an email address, which is Islamophobia Center, all one word, Islamophobia Center @gmail.com. So you can write to them. That's the Islamophobia Center @gmail.com. That's the Islamophobia Studies Center. So, yeah. Okay, so and xenophobia, really, in my view, is like it's a lighter concept than racism. I mean, people began to think that racism is too strong a word for certain kinds of behavior, and xenophobia as the idea of the fear of a stranger, right? Fear of strangers, that's the kind of literal definition of xenophobia, was increasingly being used, and I've used it myself. But one of the main criticisms of the two terms, Islamophobia and xenophobia, is that it medicalizes it. The idea of a phobia, right, is a medical term, like a mental illness, a phobia of some kind, like fear of spiders, something, a phobia. And so, in a way, it detracts from the political nature of what we're really talking about here. And the racist nature of what we're talking about, because discrimination on the basis of religion is comes into the definition of racism. And so, nonetheless, it continues. It's now been established as a term, and though that kind of criticism is a kind of weak one now, it's not particularly important, I don't think, anymore. And I just wanted to point you to the work of a wonderfully talented anthropologist, Ghassan Haj, a Lebanese Australian, who's a colleague and friend of mine, who wrote a book on Australia called White Nation. It was his first book, called White Nation, and subtitled Fantasies of White Supremacism in Australia. And then he went on to write many other books and published articles after that. But one of the things that is really telling in his analysis, he gives the story of a woman wearing a hijab. This is in Sydney in Australia, and a man, an Anglo-Australian, comes up to her and rips off her hijab and tells her to go home, just like President Trump has just done, right? And then he says, now the thing is, how do we understand what is going on in the mind of this man? If we just say he is being racist and we leave it there, it doesn't really enlighten us much about what is happening. And he goes on to talk about nationhood. He goes on to say what's in his mind is a vision, a spatial and aesthetic vision of what he sees is Australia, his Australia. And he's been raised in Australia with a nationalist view of Australia and the flag and the national anthem and all the history of white Anglo-Celtic Australia. And then he sees this woman and he sees that she does not fit that image that he has. She is a blight on the landscape of his nation, of his idea of his country, right? Forget about the Indigenous Australians for now, right? So what, in effect, he is arguing is that racism is really nationalism. And particularly brought out clearly in these kinds of what we would call racist acts. It's an action that the person... I mean, people have racist thoughts, right? They may say racist things in private, right? And they may be racist, but they do not actually act upon that because they're afraid to do so, or they might see that it's something that would create problems. But nonetheless, they have those thoughts and attitudes. So he sees this as the idea of nationhood and national identity that is behind this idea. And if you think about Trump and what is going on, and Islamophobia, that's a similar kind of thing. If we understand it as a form of nationalism, and this idea of white supremacism that is now being talked about much more openly, I think we will begin to understand this phenomenon better and be able to try to deal with it in a better way and come up with things. And the ancient Arab proverb, the stranger is blind even if he has eyes. And this is the idea that the stranger is vulnerable and is always vulnerable in a strange land, a land that is not his, right? And that vulnerability means that they can be attacked much more easily. They don't have the resources to stand up and the confidence. But they are the ones who actually need help and guidance and need support because of that vulnerability. But we see we're now in a climate around the world that's not really conducive to that kind of support at a political level. But I think at the local level, the idea of individuals who are ethical and moral and concerned and to doing things in a neighbourly way, for example, I think is where we need to give a lot more focus. In France, the laws banning Muslim hijab in public, in schools, right? And these laws, forcing people to act in a certain way, to dress in a certain way, is the idea of having people choose between their religion and the state, that is opposed to these public demonstrations of religious symbols. And you remember the massacre in that in the church, in the mosque in Christchurch? He apparently did a trip to France, and that's where he was radicalised against Islam, was in France, and then decided to kill Muslims, and he did that in New Zealand. Right. And you have in China the Uyghurs. Do you know about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? They are being forced into re-education camps to de-Islamicize that population. But they're also scattered around the world, and there's a lot of activity. We have a paper on them in the new book that's going to come out at the end of the year. And I just want to end here with these statements by Monica Crowley, who has just been appointed by Trump as the Assistant Treasury Secretary for Public Affairs, who had repeatedly spread conspiracy theories that President Barack Obama was secretly a Muslim and who was sympathetic to America's enemies. Right? She wrote on her blog in 2010 charging Obama with supporting the right to build an Islamic community centre in Lower Manhattan, which is near the site of the World Trade Center. And she wrote that Obama had loyalties to Islam and questioned if he could support both Islam and the United States. So here, this idea of Islam versus the United States, pitting very clearly the oppositional nature. So it's dichotomous. You can't be a Muslim and support and be loyal to the United States. This is what she's actually presenting in a public way. Can he be both loyal to Islam and loyal to the United States? It's an incredible statement to make. And now she's being presented in the public as a public figure for the government, for President Trump. How could he, Obama, support the enemy? So Islam is the enemy of the United States. She's presenting this and clearly has a lot of support around the United States. And the Muslim Brotherhood that he supports and is a part of was dictating American foreign policy. Well, in fact, it's the exact opposite, but... Right? So this is Islamophobia. This is a real representation, it seems to me, of Islamophobia, and in a very powerful position, a very public, official position in the United States. How do you combat that?
Rectifying the interpretations or writing about it.
I mean, will she have to be vetted in the these hearings that they have for these sorts of appointments? I don't know. But so what? I mean, they pass through. There aren't enough oppositions, enough Muslims in the Congress to challenge it. But that's what I think has to happen. Like the four women, there has to be more of them. It seems to me.
Yeah. But here, in political circles, it's always easy to criticize the former.
Really?
So, put the blame on them. They are no longer in the office, so it's easy to blame, or accuse, or criticize, and he even went against all the program that Obama established during his presidency. Healthcare, DACA, you name it. And this is a former president, because he was an African-American president for the first time in the history of the United States. It was a big shock to the rest of the
But I remember,
Irish people.
I know it might be funny, but I was in.
My respect to my Muslim brothers.
I know we have to be careful. Alex is here, but I remember being at a restaurant. It was actually in Italy, and right next to me was a large group of Americans having dinner. I couldn't help but hear the conversation. And they talked about Obama as cafe au lait. Have you heard that? In other words, he's part white, not mixed race. So that they were justifying that he's all right, he's cafe au lait, it's not quite so bad, right? I mean, the racism in this country, and race is still an official category in the United States. It always used to shock me when I had to fill out a form that asked me what race I am. I always refused to answer such a question, but even though when I looked into it, the question is usually asked for affirmative action issues. So it's supposed to be a positive theme, but nonetheless, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't believe in the very concept of race. There's no scientific basis to race. Yes, sir?
I think the problem is when they say Islam hates us or Islam is they take Islam as a monolithic block and they consider it as a homogeneous unity, whereas it's easier, it's simpler, and it's more easily understandable for anyone. So the problem is not putting in complexity.
Yes.
Because you will find Muslims that do hate America. It's not, and it may be justified in some cases. but if they receive bombs with the US, it's normal. But it's the complexity that's lacking here.
Yes.
Differentiating between different Muslim, different lecture of Islam, and that's hard to achieve. That's a challenge.
I also think there's, the political and economic factors as well. Like you mentioned the persecution of the Uyghurs and with the Rohingya as well. I mean,
yes.
Part of that is not just that they're trying to, wipe out a culture of a people or whatnot. I mean, there's natural resources that are in their regions as well that, that is causing them to be displaced internally and persecuted. So I think it's another factor that's not, it's not just the full picture, just looking at the Islamophobia component.
Yes. And, enlightened Africans are beginning to see what's happening to Africa too. With all the imperial forces there trying to get all the natural resources and the new minerals and things like this, and the Africans are not benefiting at all. It's all being exploited and sent abroad, and all the profits are being made outside. And there's going to be a lot of activity to nationalise those mining companies that are, like the new minerals that go to make up these things. They're bleeding these countries, just like oil did at the turn of the century, until the nations took control and said, the profits belong here and should be reinvested here, and so on. I mean, the stories of the Gulf when oil was first discovered is extraordinary. They treated the local populations, the Arabs, they treated them like dirt. The British, the French, the Dutch oil companies just set things up because they had the know-how, they had the technology, they had the engineering skills. Right?
And they have the military power too.
And backed up by their military as well. Right?
The Chinese that were put in these camps, actually, the Chinese government is claiming that they are radicalized, so we have to de-radicalize them. And some Muslim countries, unfortunately, signed in support of China. While the Western world is claiming that this is against the human rights and so on and so forth.
There was a story this week that in Beijing now you have squads of cultural officers or whatever going around to halal restaurants. This is in Beijing, not Xinjiang, not the Uyghur majority area. And they're actually requiring people to get rid of halal signs and Arabic script and saying, use Chinese culture. It's much severer. So this is definitely
It's a constant thing. It's not only the West, but it's in India, it's in other parts of the world. Question, when you mentioned the African countries that got together and had some kind of a convention for the refugees, whatever. Is this related only to the internal affairs of Africa, or they accept also people from outside Africa?
It's generally for Africans. I don't know of African countries that have served as resettlement countries, that is to take in refugees on a permanent basis. It's more likely the other way around.
You heard about some of the Chinese, for example, who maybe local people in some African countries to establish themselves there.
Yes, and in Egypt, when I was there, I was watching more and more Chinese. I mean, imagine in Egypt, Chinese coming in with cheap clothing, and they go door to door with these sacks on their backs. Oh, sorry. They go door to door with these sacks on their backs, competing. I mean, clothing is very cheap in Egypt, right? And they were doing it, but they were getting a hard time too. Sometimes they were getting beaten up for doing that. But we also know that China often sends labour abroad, and the wages are not given to them. They are forced labour. Sometimes they're prisoners who are forced to go and work as prison labour and trafficked into other countries. And also North Korea. There was a scandal I think it was in Qatar. There were a couple of hundred North Korean workers, and it was discovered that the government, they got paid, but the government took the money of their salaries and just left them with very little. And they were all deported. So all sorts of things happen. I mean, it's a huge... Just keeping abreast of all of these things is a big job.
They mentioned very recently why Asian, for example, is interested more in African countries than other parts of the world because they found easy access to those countries and cheap labor.
It's a huge potential marketplace. It's relatively untapped, and so they're all.
Naturally, they destroyed even the local traditional industries.
Almost every news channel, television channel that I get in Qatar, all have African segments to them. Long programs just on Africa, and that in itself is a sort of indicator, I think, of the interest in Africa today, because of the potential that's developing.
In some of these countries, the Chinese also, they eat dogs and they eat donkeys. They kill all these animals.
Well, is that a problem? Do you think that's a problem? Would you eat camel?
Camel is acceptable to listen, but not the donkey.
Not a donkey?
Donkey is questionable.
Except go to the medical school.
You know, there was in Australia, for example, the kangaroo is a sacred national icon. Nobody would eat a kangaroo. That's changed. Now they eat kangaroos because they allowed them, because they're a protected animal. There's now too many of them, so they're allowed to kill off some of them to reduce the numbers, and so they're now serving. And kangaroo meat has absolutely no cholesterol in it. It's a very, very healthy meat to eat if you eat meat. You know.
If you don't grass, right?
Yep.
So
That's right.
it's like deer and not tomato, gazelle.
No fat on them.
We invite you to barbecue kangaroo.
I have eaten it actually. Yeah. Yeah, it's you know, if it's barbecued on a proper barbecue, I think it's great. But then anything that's cooked on a barbecue for me is good. You know. But if you're going to eat meat, it's probably the better meat, kind of meat to eat. That doesn't have any fat. I don't know. We're getting into cuisine now, are we?
Because they exercise and they burn all the fat. It's a nice animal like that.
Oh, they're wonderful.
Anyway, as far as the Australian government, what is their policy regarding these boats that come in from Malaysia or from India?
It's shameful. That's what it is, and it's bipartisan. Doesn't matter whether it's the Conservative government or if it's the Labor opposition. They're all taking the same position, anti-refugee position, anti-boats, because it gains votes. I mean, this is the shameful nature of this phenomenon, that people, even immigrants themselves, we find in studies, are against other immigrants coming in. And you have like the latest, sort of like Iraqis are the latest influx. Then after a while, the Syrians. So if you talk to the Iraqis, they don't want the Syrians to come in, right? So you get this, what's called this inter-ethnic rivalry. Exactly how you explain it is really not clear, but the sociological studies show this. It's a really strange phenomenon.
So, I love my father so much, right? But he came to this country when he was 13, so there's this identity that develops as a Mexican. Well, for us as Mexican Americans, we like to call ourselves Chicano or Chicana. We have our own culture, separate of Mexican culture. But one day, I caught my dad saying this. He said, I don't want them coming here because they're cheaper labor and I'm going to lose my job. And I love him, but I corrected him so fast. And then he was just like, when you got it right, that was me once. But it happened. And we were just like in disbelief that he was having these feelings towards these new young male workers coming into this country. But it happens.
Yeah. Well, I meant to say that migrant labour is fundamental, right? Because the demand for migrant labour is because migrant labour inevitably is cheaper, right? And illegal or irregular migrant labour is even cheaper still, because they're always under threat of being revealed as being illegal and they can be arrested. So they'll work for even less money. And this is all around the world, all around the world. You know, from North Africa to Spain, in the Spanish agriculture, it's all North African workers. And in the theories of migration and labour, it's always there. And there'll always be this demand for them. I mean, if you want to hit, I mean, the theory is this, that you have a kind of structure in the labour force, and it's a status structure, right? And a hierarchy within occupations and so on and so forth. Now, there's always going to be people at the bottom. Now, people don't just work for money, because people also work for status. It's fundamental, right? So you work, you want to rise, if you're on the bottom, you want to rise up in the ranks to improve your social standing and social status in the community, right? Now, if you're on the bottom, you want to rise up. But if you're a migrant worker, you're not looking to improve your status in the country that you're working. You can be, you know, I mean, there are all kinds of stories of, you know, people leaving and they write home to their mothers and say, yeah, I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And in fact, they're doing really menial work, but they won't tell anybody. They just send the money home and they pretend that they're in a better situation, right? But in the country that they're working in, their destination country, there's no ambition for rising up in status. Their status goes up in their country back home when they send the money home and their families improve because of the money that they're sending home. Because they only go to a country to earn more than what they would earn back home, right? So, and you can see it in those countries. You see the migrant labour houses. They're better than the others, than their neighbours. They're painted, they're brighter and they're bigger and so on. You can see them, they're very clear. And they show that they've got more money because they've got somebody abroad sending this money to them. So this is the thing, they don't have to rise in status. It means that they can do the lowest jobs, right? And that's what is needed. They need people to do these menial jobs that no one else will do. And migrant workers will do it.
So is there a terminology for that theory?
Yes, it's called the dual labour market theory. It comes within dual, D-U-A-L, dual labour market theory. Yeah.
Actually, even here within the context of the United States, the African Americans were also complaining about these migrants that come because, like her father said, they're going to take our jobs away from us, and they are lower paid, and
Yes.
they live concentrated, and like a room like this may house 20 people.
Yes.
They sleep there, and they eat together, they save money, and they can send to their families back home.
And this is an immigrant country, like many. And that's what happened, 50 years ago. And they lived poorly, but they built up, and then they became middle class. And then so others are coming in all the time to replace them, because they've risen in status and wealth and security.
I think that, I mean, I might be wrong, but I think that there's something that happens, or maybe that it's just in this country with labor jobs, and like in particularly there really isn't mobility. So, I mean, you work and work and work, and you never rise in the ranks until your body can no longer work anymore,
Yeah.
and then you drop out.
Right.
And then you're replaced. So it's not like there's any, like, those construction workers, like, speaking from experience, are never foreman.
Right.
Never are
Right.
foreman. They just work and then they get replaced.
Yes.
Since the system for these big construction projects incentivizes people to, place the lowest bid in order to secure contracts and so forth, are there any efforts to penalize the companies who don't pay people and prevent them, for example? So make it so that, because essentially people are incentivized, to do something for the lowest cost, and then it kind of trickles down to how they treat the workers. So if a company, for example, violates certain, workers' rights and so forth, can they be placed on a blacklist so that you're not even eligible to bid on
Yes.
projects?
That happens. That does happen. We don't know how prevalent it is. But one of the things, one of the reforms that I've advocated for is that in the tendering process, there should be a category on labour costs that's explicit and transparent, because it's not at the moment. So that the company tendering has to show how much it's going to cost to actually recruit for them and them to pay the recruitment costs, and that the workers don't pay. And this is now a huge global campaign by all kinds of big organisations, and including some private corporations now. I mean, I've done presentations to these big companies, Coca-Cola and Nike and all these things. I've shown them this evidence. They loved it. To be able to see it, because then they're confronted with it. To show the evidence is really powerful, instead of just talking about it. And right, so there are things. So if in the tendering process you have this facility for them to be more transparent about the labour costs, and to show that they have paid and that the workers have not paid, which means you have to interview workers. Now, there was a big case of a company in Qatar, and they were charged in France for having slave labour. They immediately, it's a big transnational corporation, so they were really concerned. They really jumped quickly, and they made sure that their next recruitment drive, the workers didn't pay anything. And so they've been much more progressive and transparent about it, and showing that, yeah, it did happen, we fixed it. So these things can occur, but they're slow and piecemeal. But this is why when the state cannot do it, you have to. I mean, this is the commercial sector. This is bribery and corruption in the commercial sector. It's not state corruption. Right? So, to what extent is the government or the authorities responsible for this? You know, the organisations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, International Trade Union Confederation, and the International Labour, all of these organisations focus on the state. They focus on the government. The government should do this, the government should do that, pass legislation, change the reform the... All that's fine and important, but in the end, you need people to be moral. You need to shame them and say, this is not ethical behaviour. You need to do something about it, and you need to be true to your religion. It's because every company in the Gulf states is 51% owned by a national in order to allow them to come in and operate. So there is a responsibility there if they are a 51% shareholder. But they're not taking that responsibility because they they tend to just be passive owners and just take the profits, you know. So I had a confrontation with the Qatar Chamber of Commerce over that. So it's a long process. Any more comments or questions?
Well, the greed there for capitalists is always to minimize the expenses of their business to make the largest profit possible, and that's the basis of injustice toward these people when they bring them in to work for them.
Well, look, there are principles. You know, I mean, if the banks are, you know, against riba, or do they find ways around it? I don't know. I don't have all the answers, I'm afraid. But somehow there are people who do operate on the basis of their principles, and they're strict with their moral principles, and they don't waver. Others go around it, or they don't mind, or I don't know. I don't know how some of them sleep at night, frankly, when you have a look at the way in which some people are treated.
Goes back to the issue of individual, you know, fear of God, if they are pious, you know, whether they fear some punishment in the hereafter or not. Of the ethics system, you know, is based on this kind of God consciousness.
Yes.
But if they are only focused on the wealth and greed in this world, they may do anything to become richer, and they don't care about the rest of the world.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's a reality.
It's some revolution within the minds and hearts of people, you know, to bring them back to the form of the Islamic ethical system. Otherwise,
I mean, it's all there. The principles are there. The guidelines are there.
Can you speak to a little bit more about the environmentally displaced people and how you think that's going to increase with the exacerbation of climate change?
Well, I have absolutely no doubt it's going to increase. The question is when. I mean, there are some countries and islands in the Pacific, for example, that have already been gone underwater, and countries like Bangladesh, for example, very low-lying. I mean, these are in great danger. There are some people that have already left in anticipation. New Zealand has taken a lot of people. But there's no legal classification or facility for them to be classified as refugees and to be recipients of refugee protection. So those, and typically where there are crises, the people who can most afford it are the first ones to leave because they have the means to leave. That happened with the Iraqis, it happened with the Syrians. I saw that in Egypt, for example. Those that had the money, they fled, and they were able to buy apartments and even set up businesses and so on. But over a period of time, I mean, refugees typically think that they'll be able to return soon. Look what happened to the Palestinians, right? But sometimes it just doesn't happen. And so they deplete their savings and they end up in poverty, even though they may have been quite comfortable financially before. So there's all kinds of stories, and so it happens with, and will happen with these environmental crises. And we know New Zealand, in fact, is going to be one of the countries that will be least affected by climate change. It'll be a safe place to be. And so you have now an incredible inflation in New Zealand, property and real estate inflation, because you have people from Hollywood, rich people around the world are buying properties and land there in anticipation of the possible future climate crises. So those who can afford it are making plans now to those places that are considered to be the most secure. And typically the wealthy will, yeah, yes.
Well, talking about security and something, if they plan to resettle there, and God is sending a message through earthquakes also on Hawaii, volcanoes and stuff like that. Houses and cars were buried recently in Hawaii. While it was the ideal place for vacation of the wealthy and the well-to-do. So the concept of safety is very relative.
Yes, it is.
You may not think about it.
Oh, absolutely. You know, it's highly problematic. I mean, for example, the island, I don't know if you've ever heard of Tasmania. Tasmania is this big island in the south of Australia. And that also is going to be a safer place than the mainland of Australia. So I have bought land there for my children, for the future, in case. But, you know, as somebody pointed out to me, okay, let's say there's this huge crisis, and there's drought, and people are starving, and they're looking to go to where they can live. So if you own something there, they're going to come and share it with you, and they're going to force themselves upon you, you know, unless you are going to build a big wall. And how are you going to, you know, how are you going to live like that, you know? Even the wealthy who are buying up all these properties, if it's a big crisis, people are going to flood in to save themselves, you know, who's going to stop them? Are you going to have, you know, barricades and guns on your walls, and, you know, what are you going to do? And then just keep eating canned tuna fish or something for... I don't know. Scenarios are amazing.
This earth is not heaven, so it's not going to be safe for anyone. We have the story of Noah and his son, when he asked him to get to the ark and ride with him. He said, go to the top of the mountain, I won't be safe. He said, nobody will be safe here unless Allah. So let's leave there for history.
Yeah.
Now, I have a question. This migration phenomenon, compared to the past, we hear about, for example, North America, migrations from China, people who settle here. How old is this phenomenon, basically? People's moving from area to area on this globe.
It's always been there. Human migration has always. We like all sentient beings move. We cannot keep still. It's part of our nature, is it not? Even when you're sleeping, you're moving. We are all moving all the time. And, you know, we've got technology to help us. Cars and trains and aeroplanes and rockets and all sorts of things to help us move faster and further than ever before. And that's just going to continue. People move. It's fundamental.
And go out of space too, as tourists.
Off to Mars. Sure, why not? Yeah, I mean, that's I mean, philosophically, it's there, and we need to acknowledge
It's
that.
more emphasized and more frequent than in the past, I believe.
Yeah, of course. But what we're seeing now is a backlash of nationalism and anti-migration. Anti-migration in the sense of foreigner, right, who they don't like. You know, it's what you look like that they don't want. Okay, so it can be based on the colour of your skin or your religion or your, I don't know.
Even Brexit, the British, they are against the Eastern European coming to England.
Yep.
They are not a different race or something like this.
I know. It's very interesting. So, this is something that, really bothers me at this particular historical moment, what's occurring around the world, how, and to the extent to which it will be sustained, I don't know. But you're seeing leaders being elected or appointed more and more in this mold, which is anti, white supremacist type attitudes.
Are you going to publish these studies somewhere?
Hmm?
Are you going to publish these studies somewhere, or from a book, or?
My work has not been on Islamophobia, on this sort of stuff, but more on the migrant labour and such issues. And I published quite a bit on that.
Which specialized periodical were published in?
Well, I edited a special volume of Sociology of Islam. There are a number of articles there, and I have a piece there. I publish mostly chapters in books, edited books. You can, if you want to look at some of my work, you can look me up, and you can download freely some of my articles and chapters in academia. What's it called? Academia.com or something like that. Yeah. Or if you just write to me, email me, I can send you whatever you like. Jureidini, Jureidini, at hbku.edu.qa. Jureidini, yes, it's Lebanese. It's a Lebanese. My father was Lebanese, my mother Palestinian.
Can you spell it again?
Yeah, I can. J-U-R. It's on your program, by the way, but Jureidini, N for number. Jureidini, or Jureidini in Arabic. Shall we leave it there? If there's no more, anything else?
Any other question, comment from the participants?
You all look tired. Yeah.
There is actually no political entities actually that advocates for the rights of mistreated or abused workers.
Oh yes, there are plenty. There's an organisation called Business and Human Rights that has been very active, and they have a research section, and they use my work as well, and they reach out to corporations, right? And there's now a UN global, what's called the Global Compact on Migration, and the Global Compact on Refugees, that comes out of a New York meeting some years ago. That they have now been completed last year, at the end of last year, these compacts, and these are guidelines. And there's a UN guidelines for business on human rights and the rights of workers and so on and so forth. Yep. And there's legislation, against the corruption, anti-corruption legislation, In the United States, you have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. That is wide-ranging. It means that any US company that is found using bribery with officials anywhere in the world, they can be prosecuted under that act. I've spoken to the State Department about that, saying that it's too narrow. They define bribery more or less exclusively in relation to officials, government officials, when they should broaden it to include commercial transactions. The UK has the Anti-Bribery Act, and now the Modern Day Slavery Act that covers all of these issues. European Union has the Financial Disclosure Act that covers these issues. OECD has legislation or conventions or something that covers these issues. ASEAN, Asian countries. So there is this and also there's a really quite well-used legislation is the California Supply Chain Act or something like that. It's a very good legislation that is used a lot, quoted a lot. California Supply Chain. See if I can find it. I wrote a white paper for the International Labour Organization on recruitment.
Study also about the differences in salaries between, let's say, U.S. citizens or British citizens versus the same qualified people from different countries?
Yes, it's a big issue in the Gulf and also in Qatar, that you have workers doing the same work but coming from different countries, but their salaries are different. And this is a breach of the principle of equal pay for equal work or equal value. So it's not, there's the gender wage gap, but there's also based on nationality. So they've been charged with racism with regard to these differential wage rates based upon nationality. But what I've argued in my work is to give them the benefit of the doubt, to say, look, this is a function of an international labour market, so that the market is based upon nation states. So if you want to recruit workers from Nepal, you go to Nepal. You negotiate with Nepalis with regard to the wage. And you go to Bangladesh and you can negotiate a different wage rate. And that's why they come to Qatar. They're doing the same job, but they're getting different wages. And what's really sad about that is that when I spoke to workers about that, to see whether they were upset, they just sort of accepted it. And they would say, oh, it all gets worked out because there are different exchange rates between the different countries. And, that's just nonsense, but that's what they believe, right, to justify it.
They need that income anyway.
Yeah, and so this is a problem, and I don't know if it occurs here, but it is a big problem in the Gulf. أهلا.
أهلا وسهلا.
I think we're finished.
Yes.